These days, everybody seems to be building an AI agent, but if you do it correctly, we should probably talk about some best practices. On episode 60 of Tool Use, we're joined by Sam Bhagwat. He's the founder of Mastra, an open source agent framework in TypeScript. He is one of the co-founders of Gatsby, and he's written both principles of building AI agents and patterns for building AI agents. So Sam really knows his stuff. Today, we'll be discussing his book and what you can learn in order to build the best AI agents possible. So please enjoy this conversation with Sam Bhagwat.
The primitives are around sort of like agents, so kind of like running in a loop, having tool calls, memory, human in the loop abstractions, as well as kind of like a stateful workflow graph where you can precisely define like the logic around how which steps are being executed. Have the LLM kind of drive that. You also need sort of abstractions around tracing, because observability is really important when you're building agents, as well as evals and kind of like testing agents. So those are kind of the key elements or aspects that we built into Mastra as a TypeScript agent framework.
Excellent. And I've heard a lot of AI agent frameworks get dunked on when people are like, oh, we got to build custom. We don't know best practices yet. But when you talk about these primitives, everyone needs those. So
Yeah.
what use cases or what situations are frameworks appropriate and helpful? And when are they kind of unnecessary and just add burden to the process?
The bad reputation that like frameworks, the reputation that frameworks got was, I think, started in like early like 2023, sort of like early 2024. It was at that time it was kind of hard to work with LLMs. You had to do a lot of like this prompt engineering, and so frameworks actually developed to do that. The challenge when frameworks were doing just prompt engineering was that it actually made it very difficult to eject out of the framework. So you can imagine like if the framework is doing is sort of like taking a prompt and like sandwiching it in another prompt so that like the LLM can do some stuff better. You actually raises the floor, but it lowers the ceiling. And so that was like a lot of the issues that people had with like LangChain early on was like around that. It's like they would like struggle to like productionize it because like the ceiling got lowered and they couldn't kind of like improve the prompt because whatever they put was going to get like sandwiched into another prompt. And that's, I have like some reservations about the quality of that framework, right? Like, and to the, so I think like that was what drove a lot of the perception around frameworks then. What's happened since then is that the abstractions around agents like running in a loop, right? Tool calling, memory, workflows, all these like basics of building agents have gotten much more established. That happened kind of at the end of 2024, which is when we were sort of starting Mastra, and then they've been fairly solidified kind of like throughout 2025. It's kind of the year of agents, and then there's like things that we've learned kind of on top of that, but the fundamentals have stayed sort of fairly constant for the last 18 months or so, which is as much as we can ask for in this fast moving AI engineering world.
If there's one thing that we know for certain, it's just change is going to keep happening because things are moving so fast. We're making new discoveries. But let's break it down a little bit. So for the AI agent flow, core unit thing that starts off the prompt. Do you have any advice on like what makes a great prompt? Any surprising formatting tricks or anything either that you've learned through your practice or that Mastra introduces to help people prompt either easier or more effectively?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is that like we as engineers, I mean, typically are not the ones writing the copy on the apps that we build, right? So English is not necessarily something that we're used to sort of producing as a kind of like result of what we're doing. And so that what I kind of so I think the things that though that like we've seen, like number one, just like think clearly, ask for what you want sort of like clearly. But the number one piece of advice that we give people is spend some time reading what a production quality prompt looks like. So I share inside the book just an excerpt of the bolt.news system prompt, which kind of was publicized a few months ago. And you can see what a kind of production grade coding agent, there's, it's sort of like probably like 1,500 words, and like every like there's probably like 35 different instructions in there in certain ways. Sometimes they're wrapped in sometimes they're sort of wrapped in syntactical brackets and such. And I think like just spend time, browse sort of like 5 to 10 production grade prompts. And then like when you do that, like you will kind of see what a production grade prompt looks like, and like and it will give you, maybe you don't need to write that like day one, but you're when you're sort of starting to build an agent, but you can over time like evolve your prompt to look and be structured something more like that.
And do you recommend or have experience storing the prompt in the code versus keeping it external, like a in a config file?
We typically suggest putting it alongside in the code. Usually, like the reason that we encourage folks to do it, like in Mastra, the way that it works is like an agent has like an instructions key. And so you can put in the instructions, and of course you could store it in a separate file, export a const, and just import it into there. But the reason that we typically, this is in some ways similar to what we saw. Like it's kind of nice to co-locate your CSS next to your, JSX, because when you do that, like you can just the things that end up being rendered together, like that, you sort of like have high cohesion and low coupling, right? The things that like are next to each other in the code kind of belong together. And you always want to be structuring your code in a way to achieve that, no matter what you're building.
So beyond the prompt, what kind of makes an agent rather than just an LM call is a lot of the tooling it gets access to. Do you have any advice on the thought process for designing tooling before you even write code?
One of the things that we do is it's sort of like we often will like whiteboard with folks who are in early stages of building an agent, and they're kind of like, I want my agents to do these things, I want my agents to do those things, I want my agents to do the other things, because and like, so for example, like if you're the reason why we do this is that you imagine agents, when they're given a list of tools, need to decide what tools which tool to choose at any given time. Part of this is like based on how good your tool descriptions are, but part of this is like your tools in relationship to each other. So you can imagine, like if my daughter is like asking me a question of like, I might want to give her like three clear options that are like clearly different. So we could go to the park, we could go to your friends, or we could go to the science museum. And like if these are like sufficiently different from each other, like it makes it easy for her to make a decision about what she wants to do. But if they're like very similar to each other, well, we could go to this side of the park or that side of the park, or like like maybe it's like tough for her to make a decision, right? Because like those are really similar to each other, and like I don't know which one I want. Like it's in a similar way, you kind of have to make the choices easier for the agent to make by making like making the divisions clear.
Nice. And would you recommend tools be like very, very tightly defined, like a very well-defined atomic unit of work, or do broad tools help more in terms of just needing less definitions within the setup?
It really just comes down to sort of like how do you make it clear what the agent dot so one is kind of like tool choice. The other is like if you have a broad tool, like both can work, but if you have a broad tool that's doing a lot of things, and let's say it takes, maybe it's making a bunch of third-party API calls and it takes 25 seconds to complete. From a UX perspective, you are going to want to sort of stream intermediate results along the way. Or maybe, for example, that tool is kind of like a workflow. So a graph-based workflow where you're like, hey, should I go to node, should I go like down branch one or branch two, or down branch three, branch four, like that sort of decision process. So like, and that could, so as long as that workflow has like a clear sense of what it does, and you're streaming the intermediate results, you're fine. Where it gets tricky is when people are like, well, I made this like really broad tool, and then it just sort of the user is like, the user is like waiting until it's like complete, and then it took a long time because users are very latency sensitive in general. This is the principle of application development, and even like you know LM like agentic development, like one of the key challenges that we don't see as much in web development, right, is that like in web development, well, like unless there's some issue like with database contention or whatever, like you should be able to get, or like your performance of your website, you should be able to get a response in like a couple of seconds, right? And that's not necessarily the case with LLM. So it has to, like I think like one of the things is like you can go either way, as long as the choices are clear, and as long as you are yourselves giving clear indication to the users of what to expect along the way.
Excellent. And in regards to the tools, sorry, for avoiding over or under calling the tool, like either calling too frequently or not frequently enough, is the description the only thing that the builder should care about, or are there other aspects to setting up the tools to help with appropriate calling of the tools?
Yeah, I mean those are like the key things to think about. That I would say the other thing to just kind of like think about is even on a higher level than what tools I'm giving to a particular agent. Let's say that I have 30 tools or 50 tools that I'm giving to an agent. Now it's going to be hard for the agent to make the right choice because like it's kind of the needle in the haystack problem. In this case, maybe you want to have like a supervisor model where you have like one agent that, and you can break it down into like, well, this agent is like responsible for this group of functionality, and then that agent is responsible for that group of functionality. It's essentially making it kind of like a two-step process.
Nice. And actually, on the note of a supervisor agent or like a manager agent, what type of multi-agent setups do you see work and don't work? Is the group chat type thing appropriate?
We haven't got the group chat working yet. Yeah, no, no, no. Very few people have gotten the group chat working yet. We have an experimental abstraction that does something like the group chat, but like it's called Agent Network. But in general, the people would like to do the group chat. There's demand for the group chat model, but the models typically don't execute that well because it's unclear who is the decider at any given time, and so we haven't figured out the right abstractions yet. I mean, check back in 6 or 12 months, the answer may have changed.
Amazing.
Mhm.
Actually, speaking of who has the correct answer, a major component of these systems are keeping human in the loop. How do you recommend people approach getting user feedback mid process, mid workflow, rather than waiting to
Yeah,
the end to see the result?
there's a couple different mechanisms. I think like so actually, let's start by talking about architecture. So you can imagine like a few different modes of agent interaction. You could imagine, on the one hand, maybe I'm like doing some work. I don't know, classifying insurance claims. And I have a agentic assistant alongside me that's like giving me some information. But like ultimately, it's like my decision. Prove, deny, or whatever, right? Like fraudulent, non-fraudulent. You could also imagine like the exact opposite side of the spectrum where like the agent, is just like being given the insurance claims and it's like processing all of them without like asking for human feedback at all. And then you can also think about there would be like lots of midpoints along the spectrum. So maybe like the agent is sort of reviewing it and giving me a recommendation, and saying these are the reasons why I would do this, and then you can like approve or you can agree with it, or you could just do your own thing. There's a few different architectures in terms of how you actually have the human agent interaction going on, and then on top of that, when the agent itself is kind of executing, there are you can imagine like scenarios. So like let's say that like you have an IT type agent that's like provisioning users accounts or deprovisioning accounts. You can imagine that before it did like some sort of destructive action, like reset this user's password or like deactivate their email or like whatever. You can imagine that like it might sort of like pause. There might be certain tools that require like human approval to do, right? Okay, I need like human approval before I deactivate this user's account or delete their data or something like that, right? And then you can also then there's also the sort of thing where like maybe that human is like not sort of online. Maybe it's kind of like you're deferring it, and in that case, like maybe you want to suspend the agent or suspend the workflow, sort of indefinitely, and kind of persist the intermediate state of the data and just wake it up again then, whenever the human is around to kind of like respond or give your approval or rejection or whatever the human input the human is giving it. So there's I would think about sort of like interaction pattern, but also kind of like the precise, like when you get fine grained, you could think about like individual tool calls or like suspension of a whole process, waiting for human approval.
Yeah, and actually, I'd love to go into that a little bit deeper because I view the idea of like ambient agents or agents running overnight as something that's going to become more and more commonplace. Like clean up the stuff, get ready for the next workday, and it will need to pause processes midway through to get that human approval or interact with different processes that just delayed later. Is Mastra set up to enable that right from the get go, or are there any like design patterns that people should keep in mind to enable that type of workflow?
I mean, it's not from the get-go. I think part of the thing about the ambient agents is there's a couple different aspects of it. One is kind of the actual agent process, but the other is like the infrastructure, right? If you run an ambient agent, you might need to have some sort of like cron, like you're having some level of coupling between your agent and sort of like the underlying infrastructure that it's accessing. Maybe that's on some sort of cron thing or whatever. But we do see, I think we're starting to see ambient agents. What I will say about ambient agents, we're starting to see more of ambient agents. There's a gap between ambient coding agents and ambient sort of like and other types of things. So like, if I kick off something in Codex, it's gonna make a PR and sort of like in the background and like kind of then have it ready for me to review. This is kind of like almost like a development part of the life cycle. And like I think the really interesting thing is when we'll see agents kind of like actually doing production type cleanup stuff autonomously. That's in some ways that's like that's the real power. We haven't quite gotten there yet.
One thing that I've been exploring lately is I embedded, like, I use Sentry for error reporting,
Hmm.
but I actually have it where when Sentry has an error, we hit the API, pull the error down, feed it back into an agent, and try to like resolve it, try to make it a self healing system. Still early days, but I think that the
Hmm.
possibility is definitely there when you start having these workflows set up where you don't necessarily need to be agentic end to end. There can be manual triggers, whether it's a webhook or an API call, but then just allowing the agent to kind of dynamically figure out what's
Yeah.
going on and resolve the issue.
Yeah. And I think like that's an interesting like example as well because that touches on another aspect that we haven't talked about yet, which is like, what happens, do you have the infrastructure in place to make it easy to like override that? Oh, I'm just going to revert that commit and then like redeploy if the agent makes a mistake or whatever, right? So part of the human in the loop is like planning for for the failure case.
For sure. One thing that kind of came up is the idea of a dynamic agent. People will predefine their agent, tell them the prompt, the tools, everything hard coded in a config file or even write in the code, and then let it go do its thing. But people are coming up with more dynamic agents where we'll actually take variables from the current environment or current time, current whatever. Do you have any thoughts on when it's appropriate to use a dynamic agent versus a like previously defined agent?
We thought about this like a bit. We have this thing called runtime context that lets you sort of inject variables. Like one of the key things that you should just think about is like, will this agent's behavior be different based on user characteristics, right? What sort of how does this agent change depending on the execution context? The more the answer is, well, it changes a lot, the more you should be thinking about dynamic agents. The more it's like, well, it's kind of just doing the same thing no matter what. The more should think about static. It just like sort of like static agents. You could think of, so some examples that we see. Sometimes we see people on like they'll define agents in such a way that their users on a pro plan will have access to more tooling. For example, more tools that they could call than someone on maybe a free plan. They'll define agents in such a way that like maybe certain tiers of users have like more, again, like more tools available to their agents than other tiers of users, right?
One other aspect that makes an agent is memory. And I'd love to talk about kind of the difference between working memory, putting things in the context to allow it to operate in this workflow versus long term memory. How do
Mhm.
you draw the line? Where do you define these things? Can you just talk about memory a little bit?
For sure. So, I mean, there's a few different types of memory. A new thing that's like emerging is sort of observational memory. But so that's like its own sort of topic. But the things that we've typically seen like is this kind of like short-term versus long-term memory, like this kind of idea of working memory, which is really just like if you think about it as like a dictionary of like key value pairs or an object with like key value pairs, right? And so like. For example, if I ask ChatGPT, like, tell me about myself, it'll tell me you were a 6-year-old girl that likes squishmallows because like my daughter talks to it. So like, whereas like the sort of semantic recall or like long-term memory is kind of like, let's say that you asked me like, you know, hey Sam, what did you do last weekend? So now I'm like searching in my head for like memories associated with like last weekend in my head. I'm like pulling out a few, and then I kind of like merge it maybe with like the last few messages that we've like, recent the recent conversation and into like my context window, and then I tell you, yeah, I was like spending a lot of time with my kids or like whatever, right? That is, and like that kind of like concept of like semantic recall or like long-term memory is like typically what people are referring to. There's the memory's evolving fairly quickly. There's a few good like benchmarks that you can kind of like look at this for this like long mem eval is one where you can see sort of the progress that different models and kind of agents have made over time.
Nice. And sorry, could you tell me observational memory? What is it?
Yeah, so observational memory is kind of like if you're sort of like if an agent is sort of like sifting through a set of data, like it will kind of make observations about like, oh, I noticed that the user is asking about trips to Hawaii. Um, oh, I'm noticing that the user is asking about snorkeling and on the Big Island, which is only available on the Kona side of the island or whatever, and it'll just sort of like make a series of it'll sort of like be processing information, making a series of observations about that information, and then kind of like feeding the observations back to users, but also kind of like putting them in context for the sort of the final the final call that it makes. And so it's almost like along the way as it's processing through, it's sort of making multiple calls, calling tools, grabbing more information, making observations about that, and sort of storing intermediate representations, then taking those intermediate representations and like summarizing them at the end. So you can almost see it as a compaction mechanism.
Nice. And does that stay in the context, or do you tend to have like
Typically,
a
that
separate
stays in the
scratchpad?
context. Yeah,
Okay,
that
very
typically
cool.
stays in the context. Although, like different implementations do it slightly differently.
Nice. And how do you approach or any recommendations or heuristics around pruning the memory? How do you approach that?
Some of this is just user sophistication. So the universal like recommendation to folks is that if you notice that the context window is becoming a problem, like just ask if you can start a new start a new thread. Sort of like this is tough. So observational memory is probably the sort of techniques in observational memory are probably our best recent approach to compaction, but compaction is hard. And sometimes the best thing to do is just start a new thread and sort of like wipe away the previous thing. But just the main thing is like the main kind of principles of compaction is just kind of like you need to figure out how to usefully compress a set of like steps into sort of like an intermediate representation of each of those steps so you keep the crucial aspects. But like for example, sometimes tool calls return huge amounts of data, and like how do you compress that data without losing the useful bits? That's always a tough problem.
And do you see a solution to have like intermediate agents? Like I know Anthropic, our cloud codes as the sub agents, where they kind of have their own context and they can report back, and it's kind of isolating these big buckets of information. Do you see that as a good pattern?
So this one is pretty controversial. I mean, if you like, I don't know if you were sort of like how on Twitter you were that week, but like Cognition was like, and Anthropic sort of released these like dueling blog posts where Cognition was like, don't do subagents, and Anthropic was like, yeah, we love subagents, and it's like, okay, like so I think like the fair thing to say is that results are mixed, and when the experts differ, it's hard to kind of like have a useful like recommendation.
It's so true. And like I said earlier, we're still just figuring this out, so we don't really know what the best practices are until you just try it and see what works. Um, for the idea of sharing information between agents, whether it's a sub agent pattern or not, the difference between, or one of the differences between the first edition and second edition of your book is adding in things like MCP and A2A. How do we do inter agent communication in a reliable way?
So MCP, absolutely yes. I mean, you sort of see, now and I think an example of MCP is you can see as OpenAI is like doing these, shopping search things. Their agent builder service. They're just using for the tool calling external third party MCP servers. So inter sort of like service operability through MCP servers, like absolutely yes. We hear a lot less about ADA as in on the order of like 2 to 3 magnitudes less. We do hear inside when we're inside like Adobe or PayPal, like these types of companies, right? That's when we hear about A to A. And I think like what that is it's a senior director that maybe is like a little like the senior directors are sort of like, hey, I know that like lots of different teams inside this organization are going to be building using different stacks. And that's okay, as long as at the end of the day, we don't end up with a bunch of incompatible agents. So I would see A to A as sort of like a thing to think about inside larger organizations with like lots of teams working on different things.
Pulling it back to just the general setup and configuration of these workflows for the different model providers, there seems to be this consolidation around capability, but a divergence in personality where people will go to one for certain tasks, one for another. Do you have any rules for when you would choose a certain provider for agentic tasks, or is it still just test them all, run evals, and see what works best for the given use case?
I mean, we're coming off a week where, Gemini 3 was like the best at coding for like 48 hours, right? So I think that like, I think it's really, what we see is that the best team, the sort of the top tier teams have a set of evals. And when a new model comes out, they can decide in 24 to 48 hours, which of their subtasks they want to actually like give to the new model. And if your team can do that, that means you have a great working eval scaffold. But my recommendations here are more around the process than like specific recommendations because those are going to change, very quickly.
And on top of a good eval suite, are there any other things builders should either develop or consider in order to validate the improvement of their systems?
Evals is this interesting term. We're used to building test suites as engineers, and I think we've developed a pretty nuanced set of like, well, do we want some you do want to do some unit tests to make sure this particular functionality is working. They're going to be highly reliable, but they may not indicate a lot of overall system failure. Do we want this kind of like end-to-end testing that like, maybe this thing just clogs up the CI pipe, but like it will like detect some stuff that like broke some weird nuances and it will pick up that the whole thing failed, and now we have to make sure that like maybe it's a little flaky though, and like and then like, oh, I want something in the middle, I'm going to do some integration tests or whatever, right? And I think we have this like fairly nuanced like understanding that's developed over a couple of decades of this. And I think like with evals, evals is this very catch-all term, and I don't think we've developed the same level of nuance and sophistication around that. But I would just like we encourage folks to like lean on their engineering insights and background of like, hey, do we want something that's like just testing whether this agent is like calling this specific tool at this specific time accurately, or do we want it to like, kind of like throw some like sample cases and just like measure the overall accuracy of the response over a set of 12 different agent calls and 3 workflow executions. So I think it just like the other I think it just depends, and you often need both. The caveat that I will say, and evals have been controversial at times, is that you want like a lot of the teams that are working in coding agents or consumer, like they operate less on evals and they operate more on A/B testing and just sort of vibes. And then the ones that are in more sort of highly regulated industries, legal, accounting, medical, that kind of thing, they lean much more heavily on these eval suites.
Yeah, I know for my own personal development workflows, I'll just switch cursor to the latest model, give it a spin for a day, see how it goes, and sometimes I get convinced, sometimes I don't, and I still have different agents for the plan mode versus the actual
Hmm.
execution of it because that's what I found works for me. Um, One area with the development workflow, especially as we start getting these agents with more tool calling, is when you're testing it, the dev loop gets longer and longer because they're running more processes, they're testing for things. Do you have any advice on how we can tighten up these dev loops when building agents?
It's tough. This is like the fundamental challenge of building agents. We see that like teams are able to get prototypes fairly quickly, but it can still take them a long time to deploy into production because they are going through these like just a ton of dev cycles around agent accuracy, and like figuring out all the edge cases here. The thing that we've noticed in practice is that the teams that are the most effective at going through those loops quickly. So first off, they go through just as many loops, but they just kind of go through them faster, and they sort of, and it's usually because they've done this before. And so our best guess is that as time as we all get better at doing this stuff, we'll just become better at iterating quickly.
No, it's true though, and I feel that on top of just getting experience under your belt, trying to remember that you can use these AI coding agents to build infrastructure for yourself, whether it's scripts to help you go faster,
Yeah.
build up your CI/CD pipeline to try to offload some of the testing, and run like a true linter. Don't rely on LMs for linters. Like there's a few things you can do
Yeah.
that just follow dev best practices.
Some people are like trusting the models too much, right? And you just kind of like use your intuition. Don't turn off your brain. You turn off your brain, then like the like this is true in like, yeah, cursor as well as building agents. As soon as you turn off your brain, it's more difficult to recover from failure. You should be like the same way, like you should be able to notice right away in cursor when like the model starts going off the rails and you're like, no, stop, because then like that time is wasted, right? That time like in between when you know like when it's gone off the rails and when it's you sort of no, go back to your checkpoint and start again. So I think like that's minimize that time.
Yeah, because it's not just time lost, but it's the cognitive switching of trying to fix what was broken or try to figure out what the good
Yeah.
state was, getting back to that, and then continuing a path. Yeah, it's a huge time sink. One thing you mentioned was the deployment. Have you thought of any surprises or differences between deploying AI agents to deploying traditional web apps?
One thing that we notice is that teams will typically like they tend to be okay at deploying their web apps and sites on some third-party cloud. So it might be that like maybe my infra is all on AWS, but I'm using Render or Netlify or Vercel, right? Like these type of clouds for my website or maybe my app, right? But I think it's actually like much less the case that people are, unless your infra is already on like one of those sites, that people are much less likely to trust another cloud that they're not already using. They would really just rather deploy right now in the life cycle of where we are in But like right now, people would much rather deploy their agents on their, AWS, or Azure infra, like wherever their infra is living. They just put it in a Docker container inside the same Kubernetes cluster, and kind of, and then they'll, oh hey, I need to auto scale this. Auto scaling is hard. Provision more nodes. Am I getting a burst of users? Like you have all the normal, problems that we have with infra.
Nice. And I guess going even one step further back, where do you see agents succeeding today versus still just the hype and the demoware we see a lot of?
Yeah. I mean, we see like the what we see right now is there's sort of 80/20 in terms of who's using agents. 80 being the sort of like software companies, and 20 being kind of like everybody else. So, we do see the soft banks, or like the financial and insurance service companies, Marsh McLennan using it. But I do think that's like the 20% use case right now. The biggest use case is I am a SaaS provider, and I am deploying an agentic chat inside my existing SaaS app, because I want my users to be able to, create reports inside, instead of like exporting CSVs and then pasting them in ChatGPT. And, I would like them to actually be able to create reports natively or whatever, or like search for information that's like very difficult to find because there's so much information in there. Like it's being used as like almost a new interface within the existing software suite.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions that builders have before they start deploying agents?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's almost like two things. Like one, people are either scared of it or they think that like the OMS can do everything. Those are both symptoms of inexperience. Like, oh well, like it's like no, these things are real tools. We can see that all in our experiences using Claude or ChatGPT, but they're not perfect. And so figuring out how to hammer them into the type of reliability that we need to deploy them into production, and is like the challenge of this new world.
And you brought up people being scared of it. One of the most common fears around AI agents is security. We're letting these LLMs get tooling to like do web browsing, to pretty much do anything, to act on our behalf online. What do you think people should keep in mind for security? And does Mastra add anything to help with the security aspect of agents?
Yeah, so we have input and output processors, which are basically guardrails. So you can check input before it hits the LM. You can check output before it goes back to the user. That's the most typical, and I think that's a fairly common pattern. We implemented, obviously, but certainly not like we came up with it. More broadly around security, the thing that Simon Willison has sort of like talked about is like this concept of like the lethal trifecta. And what that means is that if you have sort of untrusted input, and you sort of have access to private data, and then the ability to sort of exfiltrate that data, like that is when you run into a challenge. But any two of those things are fine. Like untrusted input, no access to private data, and the ability to like, to sort of exfiltrate data, that's fine. Like, whatever, right? Like, untrusted data, and untrusted data, and access, or untrusted input, and access to private data, but no ability to exfiltrate it. Yeah, you're fine. Like you can't tell the user anything like dangerous, right? Like, but like when you hit all three, that's when you have a problem.
Yeah, and we've talked about the lethal trifecta before because it's the danger of convenience when people just want these things to work on their behalf and they don't want to
Uh-huh.
put too many blocks in the way because they just want to get the benefits of automation, but all of a sudden they're opening themselves up to vulnerabilities that they don't even know. And I think AI web browsers are one of the most risky ones because all of a sudden you're exposed to the internet. There's infinity threat attacks there.
Like I think a lot of times when we're feature flagging, we end up doing 0 to 1. We're just checking for bugs, right? And it's like 1 to 10, 10 to 100, like fairly quickly. Might be over the course of like a day or 2 days or 3 days. A lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, for a lot of us. Well, it turns out that like maybe that sort of roll up isn't as quite as fast in when you're deploying an agent. Maybe just give it to a select group of early users, but it's really in private beta for a longer period of time. And you're like, and like that you can feel comfortable, like, hey, we know 5 users that like would really like this, so we're gonna give it to them. But like, and then you start going through the like, hey, performance, accuracy, security, like really, really like you do obviously a lot of work before that, but you don't have to do all of the work if you like save some of the work for when you're working with like early beta users.
Yeah, don't optimize too early. What are your suggestions for getting that observability tracing to be able to determine how users are actually using the agent?
I mean, the sort of the biggest one is like you know, if you use a popular framework, and if you use a popular observability provider, it will be easy. If you use Mastra with a Rise or a Brain Trust or Langfuse, like it'll be great. I think where like tracing is generally fairly easy to set up, unless you decide that you need like super custom implementation or and like that generally, you know, if you're rolling your own thing, you're gonna have to like sort of like think about deeply integrating like their SDKs with all of your like spans and how that bubbles up. So I think like honestly, you can save a lot of the headaches by using a you know like I said a great like sort of like a well used you know a popular framework that's like well integrated with a good hosting with a good observability provider.
Nice. I feel like we've covered a lot, but are there any other principles for building AI agents, whether in the book or just your experience, that you want to make sure that the audience is aware of?
I mean, there's this whole sort of like concept we started touching on it of kind of like context engineering, and that actually isn't part of as much part of this this principles book. It's more part of the second book, which is patterns for building AI agents. But you know, this is kind of like figuring out how do you make sure that the agents have the right context to solve problems. The reason we didn't include it in principles is it's more of an art than a science. Unfortunately, it's just you're sort of like you have to stare at a lot of like data and be like, well, if I was given this information, would I have the ability to arrive at the correct answer? Was the reason that the agent arrived at an incorrect answer because it had insufficient context, incorrect context, you know, too much context, or was it that you know it was given actually the correct context and then just incorrectly reasoned about it and we're so you know this is again like I said there are parts that are more of an art than a science, but context engineering, you know, just getting used to the pattern of looking at a lot of data.
Yep. Always got to look at your data. Are there any AI agents that you wish existed that don't yet exist?
I mean, we've had to build a decent amount of our sort of like, you know, our workflow from sort of like, hey, let's take this feedback in Discord and sort of like summarize it and create kind of like a GitHub issue. Or let me take this like not really detailed reproduction information that some user dropped either in GitHub or Discord. And like we're like my co-founder Abhi built like an agent to try to like make a minimal repro, which is something that's like very important when you're maintaining an open source project. You know, like so, you know, to sort of like create a change log draft from you know a week's worth of changes. So we've had to build a lot of the tooling around the maintenance and sort of velocity of a for open source and for an open source project kind of internally. Those are the those are the main things that you know we've kind of I guess our contribution our practical contribution to the art.
Sam, this has been a blast. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge. Before I let you go, is there anything you want the audience to know?
If you want a copy of this book, you can go to mastra.ai/book, put in your email, we'll send you an ebook, and we'll also send you a link where you can actually put in your address and we'll mail you a copy as well.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Sam Bhagwat. If you're a TypeScript user, check out Mastra. We need more frameworks to help guide people to building safe, reliable AI agents where a lot of thought is put into how the architecture is set up. And Sam's done this before. He knows what he's talking about. And whether a TypeScript user or not, check out Sam's book. It's free. We're linking it down below. You can get a PDF copy or a physical version, whatever will help you better absorb the best practices. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.